that we should have more markets. We should have less government. Let me ask the following question. Should government monopolize the automobile industry? Right? What happens when government produces cars? We have things like this. Or this was voted one of the worst cars of all time, the Yugo. I don't know if anybody has heard of this, but it's not the most exciting car in the world. Most people say government should not monopolize the automobile industry, although I guess now these days you never know what government is up to. They are now owning some cars. So I do need to cover this one up. Don't look here. Besides this now government-owned car, most people say markets and cars are a great thing. We've got all these competing companies producing reliable cars for everybody. And if they do a bad job, they go out of business, or they should usually go out of business. So don't look at this. I hope that's being edited off the internet. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to make the case that most arguments for government are non sequiturs. Okay, so the conclusion does not follow from the premises. If something is so important, it does not follow that it must be provided by government. And I'm going to make this case about law. Right? This is one of the most important things that we can think of in society. And I'm going to argue that we should think about having it provided by markets rather than the state. Okay. So what about law? Is there something that makes it different, that it cannot be provided through the market? Well, one of the classic arguments in favor of government provision of law was by the novelist and philosopher Ayn Rand. And she said, yes, markets are great for everything else, but it can't work for law for the following reason. You need to have government provision, because if you have multiple people producing law, you're going to have chaos. So she said, suppose Mr. Smith, a customer of government A, suspects his next-door neighbor, Mr. Jones, a customer of government B, has robbed him. A squad of police A proceeds to Mr. Jones' house, is met at the door by a squad of police B, who declared they do not accept the validity of Mr. Smith's complaint and do not recognize the authority of government A. What happens then? You take it from there. So she argues that you cannot have private provision, you need government provision. Otherwise you will see chaos. Okay, so this is the image that comes to mind. Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith, they have their own armies, they come together, and then I inserted this picture for you, Dan. We've got clash, chaos. I just found this, I don't know why. Okay, all right. It does sound very difficult. The question sounds extremely difficult, but I'm actually going to say that it's not as difficult as it seems. And actually, the question that Ayn Rand and many other advocates of government law enforcement are asking, how could this be solved? They're already solved right now all over the country and all over the world. So let me just present a few examples of how this problem could be solved. I'm going to restate the question in a slightly different manner. Okay? So, suppose student A from Loyola, New Orleans has a dispute with student B from Loyola, New Orleans. Student A goes to government A and student B goes to government B. Is this what happens if you have a dispute with the student at Loyola, New Orleans? What happens if you have a dispute, a minor dispute, with your roommate or someone on your hall? Do you call the police? Call the FBI? The CIA? Who's the first person you talk to?
The roommate.
Okay, well, yeah, that's the first thing. You can actually solve probably most disputes on a bilateral basis. For those people who want to deal with a third party, at least in my college, there was lots of examples in my college. I went to College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. You could call any number of people on campus. If it was something serious, there were campus security guards. They had a number of people. But on the most basic level, you would talk with your RA. My roommate's being mean to me. He's such a jerk. Can you tell him to turn his stereo down? Okay, this is a way of solving disputes, but done on a much more informal and local level than to call the government police. Okay, so that's one assumption I'm going to make that doesn't need to be made. Anytime you have a dispute, you don't need to call different government police. If the RAs couldn't solve it, we had in our dorms these people called complex directors. They were adults who, you know, something really is a problem, you can call in these people. If they can't solve it, it gets elevated to the next level. Imagine like going to higher and higher levels. We can have the associate deans, the dean of students. In my college, once some kids and I got on my floor, I shouldn't say this on the internet, but I will. Some kids on our floor were getting in trouble. It was related to alcohol. And we got called into the dean of students' office. And I can tell you, I was very afraid when I saw this gentleman, and all of us said, "We're sorry. We won't do it again. We will not have any parties in our room ever again." Now, was he acting coercively with us? In some level, I didn't like the fact that we weren't allowed to have parties in our room. But on another level, we all agreed as students to go to the school and agreed to have him enforce the rules. His rules were maybe not the most optimal, but they were nevertheless not too egregious. If they were too egregious, the school itself would be suffering. So think about a school like a profit-motivated firm. If the firm does not attract customers, the customers are going to go elsewhere, and the school is going to make lower profits if it's for profit, or if it's not for profit, it's going to have less demand, less students, less prestige. So they've actually got to act, for the most part, in the interest of their customers. They don't have formal rules and formal robes like government judges, but they are providing judges in a way that is quite similar. So just because they look different doesn't mean they're providing different functions. So we can think about this as like a whole legal system. You've got the resident advisor, the complex director, and then all the way up to the dean of students, who's the equivalent of the Supreme Court. At my college, things turned out to be great, after all. It was a really wonderful time, and I'm grateful for all of the great private law enforcement that they had. Other solutions. Colleges, you guys can all relate to that, but can we think of any other examples of private law enforcement or private rule enforcement that exist today? And by asking and answering this question, I want to point out that it's actually quite common. It's not one of these science fiction ideas that we're coming up with. This is actually quite common, but often underappreciated. So another one that I like to point out is Disneyland. I imagine a lot of you have gone there. And they've got people, hundreds of millions of visitors coming from all over the globe. And what happens when there's a dispute? Do you have these mean people running around kidnapping guests? They could.